If only the fire at Riverside Market had never started, Adrian Volkov's life might have followed a very different path. 20 years earlier, the market was loud and alive with color. Vendors called out prices, music drifted through the evening air, and families crowded between the narrow rows of stalls. Adrian was 12. His little sister Sophia was 6. Their mother Elena held both their hands as they walked through the busy market street. Money had always been tight, but that evening felt special. Sophia skipped happily beside them. Adrian kept glancing down at her to make sure she didn't wander away. "Stay close," he reminded her. She laughed. "I am." Then the shouting started. Smoke rose above the wooden stalls. Someone screamed the word fire. Within seconds, the peaceful market turned into chaos. People pushed toward the exits as flames spread quickly from one row of stalls to the next. Elena grabbed Adrian's arm. But in the panic, Sophia's small hand slipped from his. "Sophia!" Adrian shouted. The crowd swallowed her instantly. That was the moment Adrian believed he had lost his sister forever. The fire burned through the night. Adrian searched every hospital, every emergency tent, every group of survivors he could find. But Sophia never appeared. 3 days later, a police officer came to their apartment. The man spoke gently, but the words still felt heavy. With the number of victims in the fire, he said, many people could not be identified. Elena held her breath. The officer continued quietly. "We believe your daughter was likely among those who didn't survive." Elena sat down slowly, shaking her head. "No," she whispered. But Adrian said nothing, because deep inside, guilt had already begun to grow. He had promised to hold Sophia's hand, and he had let go. That guilt would follow him for the next 20 years. Life after the fire changed everything. Elena tried to stay strong for Adrian, but grief followed her everywhere. Sometimes she walked through crowded streets staring at the faces of children, as if she might somehow recognize Sophia again. Adrian saw it all, and blamed himself. He worked every job he could find, loading trucks, cleaning warehouses, doing anything that brought money home. Over time, Adrian learned something important. The world respected power more than kindness. And if he ever wanted to protect the people he loved again, he would need both power and money. Meanwhile, Elena slowly began losing her hearing. At first, she struggled to catch small words in conversation. Later, she relied mostly on written notes and simple gestures to communicate. The silence in her life grew heavier every year. But the memory of Sophia never faded. But Sophia had not died in the fire. During the chaos, a volunteer helping with rescue efforts found a frightened little girl wandering near the edge of the market. She couldn't explain where her family was. She only remembered her first name. With hundreds of people injured or missing, shelters were overwhelmed with separated children. Eventually, the little girl was placed with a foster parent, a quiet woman named Maria. Maria had been deaf since childhood. She communicated with calm hands and patient expressions. At first, the child struggled to understand her. But Maria never rushed. She simply smiled and began teaching her sign language, one small movement at a time. Over the years, the memories of the fire slowly faded. The shelter records eventually listed the child under a new name, Daniela. And the little girl who had once been Sophia slowly began building a different life. Maria never spoke with her voice. The illness that had taken her hearing when she was a child had also shaped the quiet rhythm of her life. But she had a language all her own. Her hands moved gently when she signed, and her expressions said as much as words ever could. Daniela learned that language slowly. At first, she copied the shapes awkwardly, watching Maria's patient demonstrations. But Maria never laughed when Daniela made mistakes. Instead, she would smile and repeat the movement again, guiding Daniela's fingers until the signs felt natural. Their small apartment was modest, bare wooden floors, a worn kitchen table, a narrow window that looked out over a crowded street. But it felt warm. Maria filled the space with calm that Daniela had never known before. When Daniela was 16, Maria became sick. The doctors spoke in quiet voices Daniela struggled to understand. Maria, however, already seemed to know. One evening, as Daniela sat beside her hospital bed, Maria sighed slowly. "You are strong." Daniela shook her head. "I'm only strong because you taught me." Maria smiled softly and squeezed her hand. That night Daniela stayed beside her until morning. She never imagined how quiet the apartment would feel once Maria was gone. Weeks after Maria passed away, Daniela opened the small wooden box on her dresser. Inside were only a few things she had kept: photographs, Maria's handwritten notes, and a thin silver bracelet. Maria had given it to her years earlier, saying she had found it among Daniela's belongings when the shelter first received her. Daniela picked it up slowly. She remembered wearing it when she was younger, but as she grew older the bracelet had become too small. So she had tied a short piece of red rope between the clasp to extend it. After Maria died, she stopped wearing it altogether. It felt too personal, too tied to memories she didn't fully understand. But that morning something made her hesitate. Maybe it was the quiet of the apartment. Maybe it was the strange feeling that she needed something familiar close to her. Without thinking too much about it, Daniela fastened the bracelet around her wrist again. She looked at it in the mirror. The thin silver band, the small flower engraved on the clasp, and the simple red thread holding it together. It didn't look valuable, but it meant more to her than anything else she owned. Bellagio Terrace was a world completely different from Daniela's apartment. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling. Soft music drifted across polished marble floors. Every table held expensive glasses and perfectly folded napkins. Daniela had worked there for 2 years. She moved quietly between the tables, carrying trays and clearing dishes. Most of the staff barely noticed her. That suited her fine. She preferred staying out of trouble. Outside, rain had begun to fall. The restaurant doors opened suddenly. An elderly woman stepped inside. Her silver hair was damp, and she looked uncertain as she approached the host's stand.
She tried to speak,
but when the host answered, she stared back in confusion. Her hands began moving nervously. The host frowned. "Ma'am, I don't understand you." 2 waiters nearby exchanged amused glances. Daniela noticed immediately, because those hand movements were not random. They were sign language. Daniela walked toward the entrance. "Wait," she told the host quietly. Then she raised her hands. "Hello." The woman froze. Relief filled her face instantly. Her hands moved quickly.
"Thank you. No one understands me."
Daniela smiled. "What do you need?" The woman signed carefully. "My name is Elena." Daniela nodded politely. "How can I help you?" Elena pointed toward the hallway.
"Restroom."
Then she added another sign.
"Phone."
"I must call my son." Daniela began guiding her toward the hallway. But before they could move, a sharp voice interrupted. "Daniela." The restaurant manager strode toward them, his expression irritated. "What are you doing?" "She needs help," Daniela explained calmly. The manager shook his head. "You're ignoring customers. She just needs the restroom." He pointed toward the dining room. "You're here to serve guests." Daniela didn't move. "She is a guest." That answer made the manager's patience snap. "Then you're fired." For a moment the hallway went quiet. Several nearby staff members watched from the dining room. Daniela felt the weight of the manager's words. But she didn't step away. Instead, she turned back to Elena. The older woman looked frightened now, unsure of what was happening. Daniela raised her hands again. "It's okay." She guided Elena toward the restroom. The manager scoffed loudly. "You're wasting time on someone who can't even order food." Daniela stopped walking. Then she turned back toward him. She just needed someone to understand her. The manager crossed his arms. "You don't work here anymore." Daniela thought about Maria. About the many times Maria had struggled to communicate with strangers who refused to be patient. She turned away from the manager again. "I'm not leaving her alone." Those were the last words she said as an employee of Bellagio Terrace. 10 minutes later the restaurant doors opened again. But this time the atmosphere changed immediately. Black SUVs had pulled into the parking lot outside. Several tall men in dark suits entered first. Then another man stepped through the doorway. Adrian Volkov. Conversations stopped instantly. Even the manager felt his stomach tighten. Adrian's eyes moved calmly across the restaurant. "My mother," he said quietly. No one spoke. Then a nervous waiter pointed toward the hallway. "The waitress who was helping her is back there." Adrian started walking. And for the first time that evening, the manager realized the terrible mistake he had just made. Adrian moved quickly down the hallway. The moment he turned the corner, he saw his mother sitting beside a young waitress. Relief washed over his face. "Mother," he said softly. Elena immediately reached for his arm, her expression filled with worry and frustration as she began signing. Adrian understood some of the signs, but not all. Daniela stepped forward. "She says her driver left her near the market and never came back," Daniela translated. Adrian frowned. "Left her?" Elena nodded firmly. Daniela continued translating. "She waited for him, but he didn't return. She walked until she found this restaurant." Adrian's jaw tightened. He turned toward one of his guards. "Find the driver." The guard nodded and left immediately. Adrian then turned back to Daniela. "You helped her communicate?" Daniela shrugged slightly. She needed someone to understand her. Adrian studied her for a moment. There was something calm about her. Something sincere. "Thank you," he said quietly. Daniela nodded politely. Behind them, Elena continued watching Daniela closely. Not with suspicion, but with a strange feeling she could not yet explain. While Adrian spoke with his security team, Elena remained seated beside Daniela. Her eyes moved slowly across the young woman's face. Something about her felt strangely familiar. Daniela noticed the attention. "Is everything okay?" she asked gently. Elena nodded. Then her eyes drifted downward. To Daniela's wrist. The bracelet. Elena leaned slightly closer. It was a thin silver bracelet. Simple. But something about it tugged at a distant memory. Daniela followed her gaze. "Oh," she said softly. "This." Elena nodded. Daniela smiled faintly. "My foster mother gave it to me." She lifted her wrist slightly. "It used to fit perfectly when I was younger." She pointed to the small red thread tied carefully between the clasp. "But it became too small as I grew older, so I tied a piece of rope to extend it." Elena stared at the bracelet quietly. A strange uneasiness settled in her chest. Because years ago, she had once bought a bracelet that looked exactly like that. Outside the restaurant, Adrian spoke quietly with his guard. "Have you found the driver?" "Yes, sir," the guard replied. "He's 2 blocks away." Adrian's expression darkened. "Bring him here." Minutes later, the nervous driver stood in front of him, drenched from the rain. "Explain," Adrian said calmly. The man swallowed. "I didn't think anything bad would happen." Adrian waited. The silence made the man even more anxious. "A man paid me," the driver admitted. Adrian's eyes narrowed. "Who?" The driver hesitated, because the name he was about to say belonged to someone Adrian trusted. Finally, the driver spoke. "Victor." Adrian didn't react immediately, but his guards exchanged uneasy looks. Viktor Petrov had worked with Adrian for years. He handled several of Adrian's international deals. "Why?" Adrian asked quietly. The driver shook his head. "He said all I had to do was leave your mother near the market and drive away. And then, he said someone would meet her." Adrian looked back toward the restaurant window. His mother sat safely beside the young waitress. The plan had clearly failed, but the intention behind it was obvious. Someone wanted Elena alone, and Adrian knew exactly what that meant. Leverage. Inside the restaurant, Elena continued watching Daniela. She tried to ignore the strange feeling growing in her chest, but it refused to disappear. She slowly pulled a small notebook from her purse. Her hearing made conversation difficult now, so writing was easier. She wrote a question carefully and pushed the notebook toward Daniela. "How old are you?" Daniela read it. 26. Elena's heart skipped. The numbers matched too closely. She wrote another question. "Do you remember your childhood?" Daniela shook her head slightly. "Not much before I was 6. Elena's fingers tightened around the pen. 6. That was the same age Sophia had been when she disappeared. Daniela added quietly. My foster parents said I was found after a fire in the city. Elena stared at her, because for the first time in 20 years, a thought she had buried long ago began rising again. What if her daughter had never died at all? Adrian returned inside the restaurant after speaking with the driver. His face looked calm, but his mind was already working through the implications of what he had just learned. Victor's betrayal would be handled. But first, he wanted to understand something else. He noticed the notebook Elena and Daniela were using to communicate. What were you asking her? Adrian asked gently. Daniela hesitated. She wanted to know about my childhood. Adrian leaned slightly closer. And Daniela shrugged. I told her what little I know. Elena quickly wrote something else in the notebook and slid it toward Daniela. Daniela read the question aloud. Do you remember your name before Daniela? Daniela shook her head slowly.
No. She paused.
But sometimes, I feel like I almost remember something. Adrian watched her carefully. What kind of thing? Daniela frowned as she tried to explain. Small things. A crowded market. A wooden toy. And someone calling a name. Adrian felt a sudden chill run through him. Which name? Daniela hesitated. I think it was Sophia. The moment Daniela said the name, Elena's hands began shaking. Her eyes filled with tears. Adrian stared at Daniela in stunned silence. You remembered that name? He asked carefully. Daniela looked embarrassed. It's probably nothing, she said quickly. Memories can be strange. But Elena gently reached for Daniela's wrist again. Her fingers touched the bracelet. Daniela looked down. Oh, this thing. She smiled faintly. My foster mother said I had it when they found me. Elena's breathing became uneven, because the bracelet wasn't just similar. It was identical. Years ago, at Riverside Market, Elena had bought that bracelet for Sophia from a small jewelry stall. It had the same tiny engraved flower on the clasp. Adrian noticed the detail too. His voice dropped slightly. You said you only started wearing it again today? Daniela nodded. I found it in a box this morning and decided to put it on. None of them spoke for several seconds, because sometimes the smallest objects carry the biggest truths. Adrian sat down across from Daniela. For the first time since entering the restaurant, he studied her carefully. Her dark hair, her calm expression. Something about her face stirred a faint sense of familiarity. Daniela, he said quietly, may I ask you something? She nodded. Do you remember anything about the day you were found? Daniela thought carefully. My foster parents told me a volunteer discovered me near the market after fire. Adrian felt his chest tighten. That market was at Riverside? Daniela nodded slowly. Yes. Elena closed her eyes, because there was no longer any doubt left in her heart. But Adrian wasn't ready to accept it yet. Not without proof. 20 years of grief and guilt were not easily undone. Still, the possibility had already begun changing everything. Outside the restaurant, Adrian's guards finished questioning the driver. The truth became clear quickly. Victor and 2 other business partners had planned to separate Elena from her security. They hoped to pressure Adrian into signing over several valuable deals. But their plan had failed, because they had not expected Elena to wander into a crowded restaurant. And they certainly hadn't expected someone inside to understand her. When Adrian heard the full explanation, he simply nodded. Bring Victor to me tomorrow morning, he said calmly. His guard hesitated. You're not angry? Adrian's voice was quiet. Very. But his attention had already returned to something else. The young waitress sitting inside the restaurant. Back inside, Elena slowly stood up. She walked closer to Daniela. Then, she gently turned Daniela's wrist again. Her fingers pointed to a small mark just beneath the bracelet. Daniela looked confused. That. She smiled faintly. I've always had it. Elena's hands began moving quickly. Daniela translated automatically. She says her daughter had the same birthmark. Adrian leaned forward. Mother. But Elena shook her head firmly. Her eyes were full of quiet certainty. For 20 years, she had carried grief in her heart. But now she felt something stronger. Recognition. Because a mother does not forget the smallest details of her child. Not a birthmark, not a bracelet, and certainly not the feeling of seeing her daughter standing right in front of her. Adrian looked from his mother to Daniela, and back again. His mind was racing. For 20 years he had lived with one belief. His sister had died in that fire. That belief had shaped everything in his life. The choices he made, the world he built, the guilt he carried. Now his mother was looking at him with quiet certainty. Elena picked up her notebook again and wrote carefully. The bracelet, the birthmark, the fire. Then she added one more line. She is my daughter. Adrian closed his eyes briefly. He wanted to dismiss the idea, to say it was grief playing tricks on them. But the pieces were impossible to ignore. The market, the shelter, the bracelet, the age, the name she remembered. Adrian slowly looked at Daniela again. For the first time he allowed himself to imagine the impossible. What if Sophia had never died at all? Daniela sat quietly, watching the silent conversation between mother and son. She could feel something changing in the room. Did I say something wrong? She asked softly. Adrian shook his head.
No.
He leaned forward slightly. Daniela, do you remember anything else from your childhood? She hesitated. Sometimes I remember a voice, she said slowly. A woman singing while I was falling asleep. Elena covered her mouth. Daniela continued. And a boy telling me not to let go of his hand. Adrian's breath caught. Because that was exactly what he had said to Sophia in the market that day. Daniela frowned slightly. I always thought those memories were dreams. Adrian shook his head gently.
No.
For the first time his voice trembled. They weren't dreams. Elena gently reached for Daniela's wrist again. Her fingers touched the bracelet. Daniela smiled nervously. I know. It's not very pretty anymore, she said. The bracelet became too small when I got older. She pointed to the small red rope tied between the clasps. So, I added this rope to make it longer. Adrian leaned closer. Elena turned the clasp slowly so Daniela could see the engraving. A tiny flower. Daniela stared at it. I've never noticed that before, she whispered. Elena quickly wrote in the notebook again. I bought this bracelet for Sophia the day of the market fire. Daniela's hands began shaking. My foster mother told me I had it when they found me, she said. Adrian felt the last wall inside him crumble. Because there was no longer any explanation left. Except the truth. Adrian spoke the name quietly. Sophia. The words seemed to echo in Daniela's mind. She stared at him. Sophia. The name felt strange, but also familiar, like a memory waiting behind a locked door. Elena stepped forward and gently embraced her. Daniela froze for a moment, then slowly returned the hug. Tears rolled down Elena's face. Adrian watched them both. For 20 years he had believed he failed to protect his sister. Now she stood in front of him.
Alive.
Not lost. Not gone. Just waiting to be found again. Daniela looked up at him. You're my brother? Adrian nodded, his voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. Yes. Outside the restaurant, police cars arrived quietly. Victor and the men who had tried to use Elena against Adrian were taken into custody. Their betrayal had failed. But inside Bellagio Terrace something far more important had happened. Daniela stood between Elena and Adrian, still struggling to understand how one night had changed her entire life. She looked down at the bracelet on her wrist. The simple silver band. The red rope tied carefully to extend it. A small object that had traveled with her through 2 different lives. Elena squeezed her hand gently. Adrian placed a hand on her shoulder. For the first time in 20 years, the weight he carried began to lift. Because the sister he thought he had lost forever had been alive all along. And it all started because one waitress refused to walk away from a stranger who needed help. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness lead us back to the people we were never meant to lose.